our next segment here, really brief one, a quick pit stop at genever. Genever, Geneva, however you want to pronounce it. As long as I understand what you're saying, we're good. Genever is the kind of proto-gin. It is that step that the Dutch had, and Flemish as well, had before the English got their hands on it. Now, the history of gin goes back to Genever and goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. We're not going to get into all of that. But to say, just it's important for you to know that Genever was first, and the English liked it so much that they stole some of the idea and made gin. The thing that defines and differentiates Genever from what came after it, which is gin, is the use of malt wine. So malt wine is what happened when the Dutch specifically, but also the Flemish, couldn't get brandywine or burnt wine or distilled wine from France anymore, because there was a few years with bad crops, no grapes, no wine, no brandy. So they didn't have it, so they stopped drinking. No, that's not what happened. That's never what happens. But what often springs, and you'll see this over and over and over as we go through the different segments, what springs from a lack of getting the supply of what you normally want will often happen that they'll invent something else, Invention, necessity is the mother of invention and all that. So Genever starts when they couldn't get brandy. So what they started doing, instead of using grapes, they started making they couldn't get grape wine, so they started making what they called malt wine. Is they would take malted rye, wheat, and barley, and then long ferment it to make a really smooth, clean wine, or almost beer, and then they would distill that. And there's two different styles of Dutch Genever. There's oud and jong, which is just old and young. Old are more expensive, and they're not aged spirits, neither one of them. They refer to the distillation techniques. So oud is an older style, so it's a less refined, less technology-driven way to make the spirit, so you get more of the malt flavor. It's closer to like a blend of gin and whiskey, almost. Whereas younger Genevers have a delicious malty back note, but it's not as prominent. It's a smoother, more kind of mixable spirit. This is Bols Genever. This is the one we use, and it's definitely a young Genever. It's 50% malt wine, and then 50% distillates infused with botanicals. So they're starting with this malt wine and then just backing in juniper is the main botanical that are in all these distillates. It's literally the Dutch name for juniper is Genever. So that's where the spirit gets its name, that juniper berry. So all Genever has to have juniper in it, and then consequently the next stop on the evolutionary train, gin, gets its name from Genever. It's a truncation and anglicization of the word Genever, and also has to have juniper in it. So juniper is that kind of that thread that needs to come through with it. Now it's known as either Dutch gin or Holland's gin. You'll see that in old recipe books. You'll often see both of those names used interchangeably. It also is the original derivation of the phrase Dutch courage. When you need that extra shot to get you to do something, that's where it comes from. The Dutch soldiers used to carry a little flask of gin on them before they went into battle. They would drink some. The English soldiers that fought with them realized, hey, that's a good idea. I think I'd also like to drink before going into battle. I could use some of that Dutch courage. So it became popular. But either way, it's important to realize that the Dutch are the ones who exported the idea of this all over the world. But actually the Flemish, the Belgians, did it first. In fact, the AOCs, or the EU equivalent of what the AOCs are, for Genever, there are more in Belgium than there are in the Netherlands. So it's an interesting spirit. It has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history, which I'm not going to go over right now. But suffice it to say that if you're looking for one with cocktails, there are a few good ones on the market. If you're looking for those oud Genevers, it's more of a sipping thing. I'll leave it at that. Genever. How do we serve Genever here at Alley 26? Well, the first answer to that question is any way they want. But seriously, we're going to make cocktails out of it. We're stocking the Bols Genever right here. If and when we get some more Ode Genever, we might have a way to showcase the flavor of that as more of a sipping spirit. But we're first and foremost a cocktail bar. So when it comes to Genever, like a lot of our other spirits, we're going to be looking for ways to put it in cocktails. Now you can make some really interesting, and we have in the past certainly made some really interesting stirred cocktails with this, but it lends itself to refreshing springtime cocktails like Collins. A simple Genever Collins might be the perfect way to experience this spirit, because a little lemon and a little sugar make this refreshing, a little soda water make this refreshing, but you can still get what makes Genever different than gin that comes after it. So that's kind of usually the way we're going to look to sneak it into people's radar and give them, but any way we can use it, we're gonna go for it. And it's certainly something to be aware of. People that are more and more interested in discovering cocktails are going to come to their discovery at Genever at different times, and they're going to come here looking to know if you know anything about this genever, and you're going to be like, sure, happy to make you a cocktail with it. And if you have a couple in your back pocket, start with the Collins, but if you have a couple in your back pocket, that's good to know. Like all the other spirits, you're expected to have a few at the ready to offer any guest who's interested in discovering what a cocktail made with that spirit could be like. So, Bols Genever. In this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about Old Tom Gin. What's Old Tom Gin, you ask? It's the one with the cat on the label. You know. So there are a few Old Tom Gins on the market. Now, Old Tom Gin was a Victorian era or 19th century style gin that's kind of made a resurgence because we all started looking through those old cocktail books 20 years ago and found they were different. And sometimes the things that called for gin either explicitly said Old Tom Gin, or if they were from before that era, they just said gin, but they meant Old Tom Gin, which was demonstrably different than the modern dry style of gin that has since come to dominate. We call it London Dry or just dry gin. So Old Tom Gin was popular in the 19th century or 1800s. It was more botanically driven. It was softer, rounder, a little sweeter, hence the style that followed after it to differentiate itself, referred to itself as dry gin, because it was drier than Old Tom. It got drier a number of ways. A, less sugar. B, more alcohol. So an Old Tom gin will probably be closer to 40% ABV, and a London Dry style will probably be closer to 47% ABV. A lot of the new modern ones will be right in the middle. Where does it get the name Old Tom? Well, following the gin craze, which was the advent, so the gin craze is something you should look up. It's amazing, a little bit of English history, where basically there were no taxes on gin because they didn't really know anything about it, but there were taxes on beer and wine. So people started making gin. Like everybody started making gin, and they kind of reference it or liken it to the crack epidemic in America in the 80s. Like it really ruined a lot of London. So they started putting taxes on gin to kind of reduce the sale of it. And then they finally, up until it was 4 or 5 different levels of taxes, and finally by the late 1730s, we got the final bit of the gin taxes. And then what ended up happening is a lot of the gin manufacturing either stopped or went underground. And by going underground, they would often mark the fact that they were selling gin clandestinely with a picture of a black cat. So it became known as Tom Gin or Tomcat Gin, and that's how Old Tom Gin gets its name, or at least one of the stories we've heard about how it gets its name. But either way, it's a softer, rounder, more accessible version of the gins we all grew up considering gin. So, Old Tom Gin. How do we serve Old Tom Gin here at Alley 26? Mostly in cocktails. So there's a few different Old Tom Gins. The original Old Tom Gin, if you look it up historically, was a clear spirit. It was softer, rounder than the dry gins that came after it, but also clear spirit. And there was a lot of overlap in the style. So there were rectifiers, meaning they're commercial distilleries that would make the base spirit for both, and then different gin houses would take that base spirit, which was basically high grain, high proof vodka, and then they would gin it or flavor it however they wanted their gin to come out, whether they wanted to do it in a dry style that was all the rage, the London dry style, or they wanted to continue doing it in the classic Old Tom style. So that's so Hayman's is a good brand and one we'll be carrying. That is that clean, clear Tom gin. Another style that you'll see a lot of, people are using Tom gins to barrel rest. Now, you'll notice this doesn't say Old Tom gin, it just says Tomcat, because it's not an Old Tom gin, because they've barrel rested it, and it doesn't taste like the category. Another popular one that we'll probably end up having eventually is Ransom. There's a really delicious one with they barrel aging it in old used Pinot Noir barrels. So it'll have this interesting pink brown hue to it, and it'll have a good little like fruit on the end. And another one that's notable that we should know going forward, the Durham Distillery's Conniption Gin launched this year the first of their barrel-aged series. The first one, I love it. It's delicious for a number of reasons that we can get into, but they're going to release a different version, a different spirit. The next one might actually be aged in Pinot Noir barrels they're talking about. So it'll be noticeably different. It'll probably look different and taste different, but it'll be an interesting idea of the transformation of what you can call a barrel-aged gin. So barrel aging is very interesting in gins, but just because something's barrel aged doesn't mean it's Tom gin, and just because it's Tom gin doesn't mean it's barrel aged. So how do we use it here? First of all, Martinez, Tom Collins, two classic cocktails that are based on Tom gin. Any of the classic cocktail canon that was based on Tom gin, anything before like the mid 1880s is probably Tom gin, not dry gin. So all of those drinks, of course, we're going to reach for Tom gin, but then and going forward, sometimes we're going to make up cocktails that are going to call for something we like that botanical mix, we like that lilt, that juniper that we get out of gin, but maybe we don't need it so dry. So we're going to look for ways in modern cocktails to come up with uses for it. So certainly know a few and have them in your back pocket when a customer says, "Hey, what's Tom gin?" And you can go, "Oh, Old Tom gin." You can tell them about it, make them a cocktail to their liking. Tom gin. This segment, we're going to be discussing dry gin. Now, there's Plymouth dry gin historically, and then there's London dry gin, and we're going to lump them all together into dry gin, basically the gin that comes after Old Tom. And that transition is important because dry gin is basically all about fad and fashion. Gins became very popular, drier gins became very popular with the upper crust, respectable gentlemen really started to enjoy gin in their gentlemen's clubs. And then respectable gentlemen all over England started to enjoy gin. So then when the upper classes, who were also the officers' classes in the Navy, started to enjoy dry gin, the rations became dry gin for the officers and rum for the enlisted men. So you had Navy strength gin, and it was made in a dry style. In fact, famously, I believe Plymouth made over 1,000 barrels of Navy strength dry gin for the Navy for just rations for 1 year. So it became extremely popular all over, and it's what helped export that flavor profile from just being the fad of the upper class in England to all over the world, because everywhere they sailed, they brought that gin with them and shared it with other people. So that's kind of that fad and fashion is how it became on. And then they liked it drier. So to make it drier, it was a little stronger than the sweeter Old Tom that came before it, and it was a little less sugar, so it was a little less sweet, and it was something they really enjoyed. It was more refreshing. Now this London dry style became very, very popular, but after a while, like by the 1960s, it was really starting to lose its sheen. It lost a first place in white spirit in the American market to vodka, which overtook it. And a lot of people, the younger drinkers at the time, were thinking it's too piney. Now with that pininess comes from that kind of aggressive juniper and some of the other botanicals, but mostly that juniper forward presentation. So you see it starting in the 80s, where some of the big names like Tanqueray come out with Tanqueray 10, and Bombay comes out with Sapphire. So all of a sudden they're starting to say, we're still making London dry gin, but we're gonna pull back on the juniper and pull forward on more of these other botanicals to make it a little more approachable. And then fast forward to the 90s, and you have this new style of gin emerging. And we're going to talk about that in an upcoming segment. But then everybody's following kind of the leader, whereas now you'll look at these gins, maybe not Tanqueray yet, but Beefeater and Bombay and some of the other ones, their ABV, their proof is coming down. Because if something's a little less strong, it's a little more approachable. And you'll notice, we just noticed that this Beefeater bottle has lowered their proof, so it is in line with more of the most popular gin in the market's ABV, which is less alcohol, which makes it more competitive flavor profile wise, but also every percentage of ABV you go down, it's more water in the bottle rather than alcohol, so you make more profit. So it's a win-win for the gin distilleries to kind of inch their way down. But that's kind of the arc of how they flow historically. But London Dry gin is still certainly the 800-pound gorilla, or it is certainly the default. When you think of a gin, when we say Old Tom is softer, rounder, sweeter, we mean compared to London Dry gin. When we say one of the newer style like Hendrick's is easier, more approachable, more cucumbery, less piney, it's then London Dry gin. So they are still the benchmarks by which other styles of gin are measured against, and it is still the dominant and most popular to make cocktails, and certainly London Dry gin, or dry gin as a category, is the definitive martini gin. Dry gin. How do we serve gin, or dry gin I should say, here at Alley 26? A martini would be a great place to start. There's a reason, the world's most ubiquitous, most famous cocktail, the king of all cocktails, the martini, the dry martini cocktail. Gin, the botanicals in gin and the botanicals in dry vermouth love each other. There's even some overlap in those botanicals, and they work really, really well together. So in order to make certainly the Alley 26 martini, we would always reach for dry gin unless otherwise specified. Our default is Beefeater, but Tanqueray also makes a puckering and delicious version of a dry martini. That being said, pretty much all of the post-prohibition cocktails that call for gin are talking about this style of gin. So if you're trying to make a faithful recreation of a cocktail in the modern era, you're talking about dry gin. So any way you want to do that is going to be good, and any riff that you're going to make that's just a half a step away from a classic martini, and that is a great cocktail to start with as your point of origin. Dry gin makes a lot of sense. That's how we do it. A couple words on Navy Strength gin. Navy Strength gin is dry gin. Okay, it's also at 57 or 57.1% alcohol historically. There might be some fudging to that number, but legally at this point, if you say Navy Strength, you mean 57, possibly 57.1% alcohol by volume, or 114 American proof. I say American proof because Navy Strength is actually the origin of the word proof. Now, Americans changed what it actually meant as a function of mathematics, but proof came from proving the strength of the gin to the folks whose rations were in gin. So if you were serving, the British Navy started using Navy Strength gin, dry Navy Strength gin, as its go-to ration for officers in the British Navy. And quite frankly, Navy Strength gin is what resurrected the reputation of gin, because after the gin craze in England and the subsequent after the gin craze, gin really had a really bad reputation as the lower class thing, as something that was not a good quality thing. Navy Strength gin is how large manufacturers, especially like Plymouth or Tanqueray, kind of reinstated that you could make a high quality product in the gin category, and it was worthy of the upper class's attention. So Navy Strength gin was born, and you had to make it to a certain strength, because if I say your ration is 2 ounces or a quarter cup of gin, then if I cut it half with water and still say it's 2 ounces, then you're really only getting half the product. The officers and the enlisted folks were all aware of that, and they wanted their actual rations worth. So the Navy came up with a system of measuring and decided on 57 or 57.1 as the line where Anything below this is not actually Navy strength, and you should insist on that because that's what you're due. We use Conniption's or Durham Distillery's Conniption Navy Strength gin. This is a world-class product. Fortunately for us, it's made 2 blocks from here. So we can be both proud of serving something local, but also stick to our guns with serving something that is world-class. And we have made any number of great cocktails with this. Certainly anything that calls for Navy Strength, you can reach for this fearlessly. But a lot of our cocktails are our own invention. We like to either use this as the base spirit or use this maybe to stiffen the spine of a drink that might come off a little weak in another way, either by splitting the base or just by inserting a quarter or a half ounce of this on top of something that might not have as much oomph as it needs. So there's so many great ways to use this Navy Strength, and we certainly like Navy Strength, and it's important as a craft cocktail bar to have a Navy Strength bottle to reach for. It is important historically, and it's great that we are able to have one that's local that is also one of the best in the world. Sloe gin, not technically a gin. Good examples of the product in the category of Sloe gin are all made with gin as the base spirit. Lesser, cheaper examples will be made with neutral grain spirit. But it's important for us, as somebody who tries to serve as a place that serves quality, to always use one that's based on gin. Heyman's is not only based on gin, it's based on gin by a respected gin producer. So those are 2 things going for it that we like. This one is 26% alcohol by volume. The EU states that any products in this category sold in the EU are 25% or higher. America, they'll let you sell 15 to 30% products, but like I said, we're going with a good product. What is Sloe gin? Well, Sloe is a slow drupe. Drupe is just another word for berry. But it's related to the plum. And you'll notice that damson plum is also a common liqueur. Damson plum gin is another a classic, however, not as popular version of a gin-based cordial. So Sloe gin is a gin-based cordial flavored with the sloe berry, also called the blackthorn. So the classic cocktail known as a blackthorn cocktail, unsurprisingly, will have Sloe gin as a major ingredient in it. What do we use this for? Well, by today's kind of modern standard, it has a medicinal flavor. Like, it has those gin notes, the juniper berry, the other botanicals that you might find in a London dry gin, and then it also has this plum flavor on top, and then it's sweetened. So it is delicious, it's interesting, but it's not kind of one of these one-note liqueurs. It's not, it's a lot more complex and layered than something that is one note and says that note right on the label. So we like to use it in things inspired by, say, a blackthorn cocktail or a sloe gin fizz, but it's certainly useful in those classic representations of cocktails made with Sloe gin.